Rugby as a sport can be extremely proud of its past and even more so of how rapidly it has evolved in the professional era across the globe. Although there is still some way to go and improvements to be made, and that's where World Rugby as an organisation plays a major role. To discuss this and more, the Rugby Business Network has the massive honour of speaking with World Rugby CEO Brett Gosper. Brett, you are possibly one of the most busiest men directly involved in rugby, and so we thank you for giving up some of your time.
It's a pleasure, no problem at all.
Well, Brett, as we all know, World Rugby, or previously known as the International Rugby Board until 2014, is the world governing body for the sport of rugby union. To clarify for our listeners' benefit, what are the main areas of focus for the organisation?
The main mission of World Rugby is to grow the sport of rugby, and in traditional terms that's meant grow participation increasingly because of the commercial element to what we do, Rugby World Cup and some other properties. It's also about growing audience numbers and growing the number of our fan base. So I guess our mission from just helping unions grow participation has extended in the recent years to include those elements of the game. We oversee much of the development that happens throughout the unions in the world of actually growing the grassroots game. We look after the laws of the game to ensure that the game is attractive and open and safe for players in particular. We look after the medical issues, all of the protocols around, whether it be injury protocols, concussion, etc., anti-doping, and of course our main commercial remit is the Rugby World Cup, as well as the HSBC 7 Series circuit and the Olympics, as well as all underage tournaments as well. So we have a tournaments area as well. We also look after the high performance of the Tier 2 nations, supervising that to ensure that they're very competitive at World Cups. It's quite a rich mix of responsibilities, but all there to drive the overall ambition to grow the sport throughout the globe in terms of participation, audience and fan base.
Well, you mentioned union development, medical issues, organising tournaments and so forth, but you didn't mention player assistance when it comes to helping them prepare for life after rugby. There are obviously many different player associations that provide this kind of support and guidance. However, how involved is World Rugby with player transition and their planning for a career after retirement, or is that something that is left up to the associations?
Yeah, well, we're involved through the International Rugby Players Association. We're their principal funder. In releasing those funds to the National Rugby Players Association, we discuss in great detail the areas of focus that they have. And one of the key areas of focus, whether it be in Europe or in the Pacific and so on, is trying to manage and help players through that transitional period once they're finished, because obviously revenues aren't quite the same, and also it can have some psychological effects on players if people aren't managed through that process well. So it's something that we're very aware of. That financial link implies that we work with them to ensure that money is deployed in the right area, and that is one of the areas that we do. We also have an athletes commission which discusses the importance of projects such as that as well. So it is an important area for us as well.
No, that's great to know. Well, Brett, you have been CEO at World Rugby since 2012. What does your role entail on a daily basis, and what do you find most enjoyable and challenging about your job?
I guess I'm trying to reconcile ambitions of the member unions and the effectiveness of the management team to execute the strategy that's really been collectively decided by those unions through the council, the World Rugby Council, which is the more representative board, and the executive board, which is the more management end of things. There's also a Rugby World Cup board as well. So you are managing a large team based in Dublin, specialists who lead each independent department. And when you're asking me what we do, I sort of in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, we've got a legal department, we've got a Rugby World Cup department, we've got a competitions and performance department, we've got obviously IT, we've got development, we've got international relations, and I'm probably forgetting some, which I'll be killed for later. But yes, you're coordinating a management team to deploy in the right way to achieve the overall strategic goals of World Rugby. No single day for me is ever particularly the same. The geography can change quite dramatically. The subjects can change as well, and the projects can over time be incredibly important on one thing, and then that at some point you might be working day and night on a new calendar for the global game, and then that just goes away for a period of time as some other urgency takes over and you move on to another subject. So it's difficult to describe exactly what your day-to-day job is because it is quite a movable feast.
And that's why I said earlier that you're probably one of the busiest men directly involved in rugby and its growth. But Brett, in your 5 years at World Rugby so far, what would you say has been your greatest or proudest achievement personally?
I don't think you put it down as your own personal achievement because it sounds like a bit of a cliche, and particularly rugby in particular. It is such a team sport. There's so many people involved in every aspect of what you're doing that you can't lay it at your own door. But I guess on my watch, if you like, rather than me personally having undertaken or carried out, but good things have happened while I've been in this role that I could take some credit for being part of the leadership team in. And I think certainly our re-entry into the Olympic was a very high point for the game, and we'll build on that as we head towards Japan. And it was a successful entry under not easy conditions in Rio, but we certainly captured the imagination of a completely new audience. Rugby World Cup would be the other one in England. Was a record breaker on every criteria, whether it be commercial, numbers of fans, and the impact the actual sport had on our fan base. So that was also something I was very proud of.
Some fantastic achievements, but not just for you, Brett, obviously for your team as a whole there as well. Well, before you joined World Rugby, you were involved in advertising for over 25 years, and you held some top executive positions at a number of companies. What interested you about this business career choice, and does it at all come into play in your role now as CEO at World Rugby?
Yes, I was in various roles in different ad agencies around the world, sometimes regional. I was running my last couple of roles with McCann Erickson, which was one of the largest agencies in the world, and I ran their US operations, and then came back and ran Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Prior to that, in the days that I played rugby, you were able to look after your professional career as well as playing rugby, because it was the amateur era, and I was playing in France for the racing club during the 80s, which was one of the top clubs and were French champions at the back end and so on. So I had the love for rugby, and I was also working in a commercial context, and I've always had the love to go into sport, and I got the opportunity. Someone said, why don't you have a look at this? I was a bit worried that it might be a little bit one-dimensional, a bit bureaucratic and a bit political. And as I went further into it and found out a bit more and interviewed a bit further, I could see there was actually a vast variety to the actual role. So got a bit excited about it and was fortunate enough that they made the choice for me 5 years ago. So yes, you deploy some of your marketing skills, and certainly when you're in the ad business, you find yourself in the boardrooms of different companies and the different ways they go about their business, and that can only help. And you're also working cross-border, which in many ways we work a little bit as a headquarters, although we don't have direct authority over our unions. We tend to work as partners with them. That often happens in a company too. You're not just command and controlling, but you're finding ways of helping and providing some templates from the centre and redeploying success in one market to another. So all of that's pretty familiar territory. So there was probably a gap in my skill set a little bit when I first arrived, but I had other fresh qualities to bring to the table, and it seems to have worked reasonably well.
That's wonderful. Well, Brett, you touched on it just now, your rugby playing career, having spent many years there in France, and you even represented the Australian under-21 rugby union team. What are some of the highlights from your years as a rugby player?
Well, as a rugby player, I was a pretty modest player, but I was lucky. I played in 2 Australian trials, one when I was 19 for the first ever Wallaby tour to Argentina in 79, and then played again for the Wallaby trial for the tour to 81 to England. I missed both of those selections, and actually in 81, Campese also missed out on selection, so I like to say that the selectors was not a great vintage of selectors that year. They didn't pick Campese in particular. And that was the year I played under 21s, and to get fit, to have a real chance to get a Wallaby jersey, I decided to go and play a season in France. That was the 81-82 season over in Europe. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I just enjoyed playing in France so much that I never went back to Australia. And played 9 seasons with the racing club in Paris, and played through till until just after I was 30 years old. So my highlights, I played some French Barbarians games against the All Blacks, against the British Barbarians, played in a few international sevens tournaments and so on. So just enjoyed rugby at that time. We were so fortunate that we could live two lives at the same time, whereas I was managing a career in advertising at the same time as playing rugby, so it was all good fun.
Fantastic. And what are some of the transferable skills and lessons as a rugby player do you find that have stuck by you all of these years now and that you are still relying on in your business career now?
It's a good question. There's no question that the ability to understand that people of different skill sets coming together to do an overall job is the most aligned thing between rugby and business. Obviously, sport gives you determination, sets you goals and discipline and things like that. And sometimes when you're outside of that disciplined environment, it can be difficult to make that transition. But what rugby teaches you is the incredible interaction with people who you're also on the field playing a sport with, but they're very different to you, either in attitude, size, background, and so on. And I think that's your first taste of just coming into an environment where there's an objective to win, to do well, to play well, but you're combining all of a sudden with people who aren't exactly how everyone was at school. I just think it's a great socializer and a great demonstrator of what teams can do when they come together in the right way with the right attitude. And I think you never forget that. And it's a great lesson to have as you go into business.
Well, speaking about business and rugby and the links between the two, how much attention would you say World Rugby places on the game itself and the player welfare in comparison to the logistical side of rugby when it comes to organising business-related deals for tournaments and so forth?
Oh, I would say that the overriding priority is player welfare. And I would say we would spend far more time discussing player welfare in meetings than we do about commercial issues. I would say that the executive board, the council and so on delegate to our team aspects of commerciality, and we get on with it and we report back, and they like to see good figures when they come in. But the obsession of the World Rugby Council and the executive board are that the players are operating under the safest possible conditions. It impacts the laws of the game, which are very dear to all of those people. It impacts obviously the well-being of all of those players. We say it's our number one priority, and it is. It is not just lip service. So it's a preoccupation. We're pretty proud of our record in protocols, in ensuring that the sport is safer now than it ever has been in its history. And that's the goal each time, to make it as safe as we possibly can, and to ensure that those injury rates do not spike, do not go up, but maintain or at least even reduce in some areas the injuries. And we're analysing stats all the time. Everything's evidence-based. We have good statisticians, good statistics coming through a number of our unions, and we have some good comparisons right through to the beginning of the year 2000 in the elite game.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that player welfare is of top priority to World Rugby. Well, Brett, 2020 is a big moment on the horizon for rugby across the globe, following the announcement earlier this year that there are to be calendar changes. Notably, the June international window will move to July, and the November test window will also be brought forward by a week. Why did World Rugby find it necessary to make these changes, and how have the top-tier nations responded?
Well, we've got some good unanimity and consensus around the new calendar. There aren't many dramatic changes in the calendar. Yes, that window shift really helps an uninterrupted Super Rugby competition, which is something the South wanted. There's always trade-offs and so on, but I'd say that was a concession that was managed well. In most other ways, the season's not that dramatically different. That was probably one of the key changes. In the more detailed calendar, there are probably 30, I think there's over 30% more games Tier 1 versus Tier 2 that we managed to negotiate in that process, which is great for the overall level of the Tier 2s and their competitivity when they come into World Cups and so on. So it's very hard to put the reasons down as to get to where we ended up getting, but everyone who sat around that table, from clubs, Northern Hemisphere unions, Southern Hemisphere unions, the International Players Association and ourselves, everyone had to give something to get something. And there's just greater harmony in where we set out from. So it's a very good result in a process that did take a long time, and it's not an easy one. But we're pleased to get to where we got to.
Well, that's fantastic to hear that. Well, before we can look forward to those changes taking place, we have the World Cup in Japan coming up in 2019 to get excited about. Is World Rugby satisfied with everything being on track, and are you expecting record revenues from this tournament like you saw in England in 2015?
It's fantastic that we're going to Japan. It's obviously the first non-tier one market to receive a World Cup, and also the first Rugby World Cup in Asia. So it is a bold new world for us all. There has been some delays in some of the progress that we'd like to see. As I say, the Japanese have not been used to putting on an event of this size in rugby terms, and so it's obviously not been as easy as just slipping into one of the major markets and moving forward. We knew coming to Asia that the revenues would be down on England because of the size of the market. Also, our major broadcasters are in Europe, and therefore their time zone and the revenues that are implied by that time zone will be reduced. We also thought there was a risk in sponsorship going down and so on. What we do know at this point is our revenues will be on a par overall with England. So we're probably doing about 20 to 25% better than we'd forecast a couple of years ago on the revenue front. So in terms of revenue, every bit as big as the England 2015 World Cup, which was obviously the record breaker. In terms of audiences, probably the stadium not quite at the size of England. We've not really announced the ticketing strategy and process yet and the objectives of numbers, but they'll be impressive. I'm not sure we'll get to the 2.47 million tickets sold that we had in England, but we're expecting big crowds in Japan. So if we can get over some of the organisational issues that we've just had in recent times, and we appear to be working our way through those in a positive way, we're confident this is going to be an outstanding World Cup in a very different context.
Outstanding indeed. But while the attention is ongoing for the 2019 World Cup, the 2023 edition is more in the spotlight at the moment, with France, Ireland and South Africa having recently made their bid presentations. What has impressed you the most from each nation's bid that puts them in the running to host in 6 years' time?
What is impressive about these bids is across the board the enormous commitment of the entire nations in these three places, but the government involvement and the government underlying and almost underwriting the three bids in a very strong way is not what we've experienced in previous World Cups. The scale of these World Cups now are such that you require real commitment from governments and real guarantees from governments to ensure a risk-free Rugby World Cup. We didn't set out that way in Japan. We've moved a little bit more towards that, but we've had to improvise in many areas. In 2023, there's been such a commitment from all three governments that we know we're sitting on three very, very secure Rugby World Cups from a financial point of view, which is excellent for world rugby. So that I think is the real change, the step up in scale and the step up in commitment, and it's great commitment to governments because unlike some other very big events that are around the world, these are low cost, low risk, high return events. We're not asking people to build stadia, freeways or infrastructure. Most of the infrastructure, in fact virtually all of it in all cases, exists. It's just about ensuring that those commercial values and ticketing values are there to inject back into the development of the sport. So we're sitting well. We've got three great bids in 2023, and we now wait for the recommendation of the Rugby World Cup board, which will be based on a technical assessment. That will happen around the 31st of October, and then the vote itself will take place by council on the 15th of November. So very exciting prospect.
And we are all so looking forward to that. Well, Brett, in your opinion, why is it important for organisations like the Rugby Business Network to exist in this current era of professional rugby, which is expanding more and more year after year?
These are organisations that, again, drive forward the love of the game, and they drive forward in a context which can often be incredibly useful for people in and around the game to connect, to find reasons to work together, but in the context of the camaraderie that is rugby. So some of these people are helping each other, some of these people are using the sport to help each other, some of these people are helping the sport itself. But what it is it's another positive pressure group in the area of rugby which progresses the sport and progresses people in their love for the sport. And I think, rugby's lucky to have that disproportionately high number of business people who are passionate about the game, and therefore that's something that should be exercised and exploited for the good of the game and for the good of the people around the game. So I think it's a wonderful concept.
Definitely. Finally, Brett, in an ideal world, how would you like to see rugby union develop as a sport globally?
That's a big question there. There are so many different areas. I think it's bringing up those areas that have huge potential. We obviously would like to see some of the new markets, some of the markets which are underdeveloped. We'd like to see some of those really progress in a strong way, because every time these markets progress, they create occasions for the game to make money, to reinvest in the game, and so on. But we'd obviously like to see China and India step up, and we've got plans behind those two countries. We'd like to see Germany, Brazil, USA engage at a high level and create some success as well in their countries for the sport. Obviously, the women's game is progressing at a rate which is higher than the men's game at the moment in terms of new entries. They represent about 25% of the world's playing population. That's another area where we'd like to see that growth continue, but also commercialise over time and provide more opportunities for the sport as well. We obviously would like to see continued success at the Olympics, the continued growth of Rugby World Cup, continued progress in the area of player welfare. So, there are so many fronts that we're pushing on, but as the global governing body, what you like to see is global growth, and they'll probably come from the non-traditional markets, and that's exciting for the game.
Without a doubt. Well, Brett, World Rugby is truly an organisation which is making such a massive difference to the growth of the sport worldwide. And the Rugby Business Network congratulates you on the incredible work done so far, and we hope to see the organisation flourish even more as rugby becomes increasingly popular to play and to watch.
Thank you very much indeed, and all the best with your organisation as well. And thank you for having me today.